Well, hello everybody, my name's Louise Savage. Welcome to Louise Savage Muses. I'm very pleased to see you if you're returning, and equally pleased to see you if you're joining me for the very first time. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Shropshire, and I just had a lovely time gardening. I've come in for a cup of coffee and clean myself up and ready to muse about the books that I've read this month. It's got off to a flying start, 2023, in terms of reading. I can't lie, I've had some absolute joys. So first up was a much anticipated book for me. I'm a massive fan of Natalie Haynes. You might not quite recognise this cover. Look at it glistening in the sunlight, because it's a proof copy. But this is StoneBlind, which is Natalie Haynes, who is a classicist, a stand-up comic. If you haven't listened to Natalie Haynes' stand-up for the classics, which is available on iPlayer and I think a lot of other sort of podcast platforms, you do not know what you are missing. It is amazing, very funny but brilliantly researched. And she does takes on lots of ancient philosophers, tragedians, epic, you name it, it's all there. So if you want to sort of, expand your classical knowledge, it's a lovely place to go. And if you are familiar with classics, it's great because it just makes you giggle. Anyway, so StoneBlind tells the story of Medusa, and it's one of those things, isn't it, when you've waited to read something, and I wanted it to be the first book I read this year, and I was very concerned that I might be disappointed, and I was really surprised actually, because having read 1,000 Ships last year or the year before, which is a very sort of serious endeavour to kind of give voice to the female characters involved in the Trojan War, that sort of neglected by Homer and other Greek writers and Roman writers. She here gives voice to Medusa, and there's a fantastic comic vein that runs through this. I found it absolutely joyous to read. I thought so you got Medusa, who of course has snakes for hair, but you also get her backstory. Actually, you realize, you find out why that is, but she's living with her sisters. I loved her sisters' sort of maternal attitude towards her. I loved the cave that Medusa lives in. That's fantastically described. But most of all, I loved the portrayal of Perseus. I thought it was absolutely hysterical. He is an airhead, according to Natalie Haynes. There's not a lot that's heroic about him. In fact, the females around him seem much more with it. Particularly loved the sort of triangle of dialogue between Perseus, Athena, who is there to kind of help him rather reluctantly, and Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Their conversations with him are just priceless comedy. So it really did reanimate the story of Perseus for me, and Medusa. And also I loved the insight into Andromeda and her family. She's the kind of traditionally the love interest in the story for Perseus, and she's got real issues with her beauty and her mother's beauty. So there are lots of important themes in here, although it's very funny, the way it looks at what does beauty really mean, and the way it gives voice to things like the snakes on Medusa's head and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I just thought it was a blast, a real blast, very clever blast. All sorts of interesting thoughts about power and exploitation and what heroism is or isn't. Yeah, a really banging good read to start 2023. I've gone on about that enough, I think. Now, second up, might surprise you, possibly, if you follow me, is Mythos by Stephen Fry, which maybe you might imagine I'd already read. Well, in a way I have. I've been dipping into this book for, at least 12 months. Finally finished it earlier this month. And the reason for that is, this is like to me, this is like a compendium of myth. So he works his way through the kind of creation myths of the ancient Greeks. It's described on the front. Oh, I'll hold it still in a minute. It's described on the front as the Greek myths retold, and that's exactly what it is, in encyclopedic detail. But what's really clever about it is that although it's encyclopedic detail, you can hang on to that detail. You know, Stephen Fry is so clever, again, you know, a comedian, so clever at giving you just the right amount of information. And I love listening to Stephen Fry's voice, and you can really hear his voice in this, really hear it when you read it. So yeah, I would recommend this both to people who are unfamiliar with the classics as a way of filling in the background, particularly about, you know, the Titans, the early gods, all sorts of fantastic myths in here. And the great thing is that there are several more. There's one called Heroes and one called Troy, neither of which I've read yet. So I'll be moving to one of those and just reading it. I love, with this kind of book, for me, I love dipping into a little bit every now and then. It just satisfies my kind of myth urge. I think I've dropped one of my books. Oh no, we're all right. And then I turned to 6 Crimson Cranes. Now, this was a book that was recommended to me by somebody at work. I suppose it's teen fiction. It's a Japanese story, and I think it's taken from Japanese mythology. It's kind of, you know, retold. I really enjoyed this because it was the sort of book, when it was colder at the beginning of the month, that was really, really good to snuggle up with. It took me back to reading fairy stories as a young person. So it focuses around a young princess called, I'm trying to remember her name, Shiori, that's it, called Shiori. And she has several brothers. And in fact, she has 6 brothers. And what she doesn't realise is that she has magical powers. And magic is frowned on in the kingdom that she's growing up in. She also has a wicked stepmother who she discovers doing some magic. And the stepmother curses her and turns her brothers into cranes. Shiori isn't allowed to speak, because if she speaks, her brothers will die. So it's just this fantastic kind of epic tale of a young girl trying to defeat some very unpleasant evil that exists in her world, and also about her love and her brother's love for her. And it's not simplistic in that each brother regards her differently. So there are some brothers that she's more fond of, there are some brothers that are more fond of her, and so it's a novel about growing up and making sense of your family and appreciating your family as you get older, but it's also just a wonderful rompy, mythy book. One of my favourite characters in it was a dragon, who appears out of nowhere, and there's also a really beautiful love story woven into this as well, and some wonderful scenery, you know, some beautiful forests and scenes of flight, because, you know, you've got the cranes, the Crimson Cranes, who are her brothers. Anyway, I enjoyed this. I think by the end of it I'd probably had enough. I wondered whether it could have been a little bit shorter. And I know there is I think it might be a trilogy even. There's definitely a sequel. I'm not ready to read that yet. Whether I'll turn to it in the future, I'm not quite sure. But I'm really glad I read this. It was lovely, lovely escapism, actually. And then I read my January reading prompt. So if you've not joined the party yet, Savage Prompts 2023, which Simon of Savage Reads and myself, his mum, are doing. The prompts have all been suggested by people who follow his channel. We picked them out at the beginning of the month. There's a video on YouTube somewhere. I think it might be on my channel actually, where we've selected those. And this month's, I was going to say this week's, this month's prompt was to choose a book that had been recommended by an author that you really liked on the blurb of another book. I struggled to do that, but I did eventually find, because I struggled to do it because I didn't want to go out and buy any books. I wanted it to be a book that was already on my shelf. And you know what? I can't even remember now. Oh, I know who recommended it. It was recommended on the back of The Lost Children's Archive by, what's her name? Valeria Luiselli, I think her name is, which I read for the Women's Prize a couple of years ago. And it was recommended on the back of there. And I have been meaning to read this book, Max Porter's Lanny, for a very long time. I've heard fantastic things about him. I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's a separate video that I did about it. But I thought this was a joyous book. Very, very beautifully written. The prose sort of melds between poetry and prose, I would say. It's very poetic. And you can see that, you know, I don't know if you can see actually, there's a bit of glare on the camera. But there's words just sort of drift across the pages. And this is about Lanny, who's a little boy who is very sadly perceived to be unusual because he likes to go off and play in the woods and he likes to create things. And actually I think, you know, I've got quite strong views about that because I think that's sort of kind of what we were like when I was a child, and also what I kind of encourage my own children to be like. But anyway, Lanny is taken by his mother to an artist to learn to draw, and the artist is very reluctant to take him on. His mother is a failed actor. She's sort of coming to terms with living in a village which is just commutable to London by her husband. Husband's kind of, I imagine him in pinstripes, I don't know, a sort of London businessman, works in finance, I think. So you've got the kind of the disconnect between husband and wife, but also, and their kind of attempts to understand him, the difference, you know, there seems to be distance between Lanny and his father. Maybe the bond between his mother and Lanny is a bit closer, but nevertheless there are still issues with how they all communicate. And basically Lanny disappears, and not only that, you've got this fantastic voice in the novel that represents kind of history and the past and nature, and a bit like a sort of green man that emerges out of the ground or out of the woods, and his voice, he sort of comments on the action and listens into what all the neighbours are talking about. So you've got kind of folktale meets reality in this, which is so cleverly done. I can't wait to read more by Max Porter, and I can't believe it's taken me this long to get around to it. But in some ways that's wonderful because I have now. So the last book that I completed was Tracy Chevalier's Remarkable Creatures. Again, another one that's been on my bookshelves for a while and finally sort of got round to. Again, I thoroughly enjoyed this because I think Tracy Chevalier lives in Dorset. She's very familiar with Dorset, and this story takes place in Lyme Regis, which is very special to me because it's the first place that my husband and I went on holiday to together. We visited it in October, and the weather was quite turbulent and it was very, very atmospheric. But Lyme Regis is a seaside town in Britain, and it has a long tradition of fossil hunting. So you can find ammonites there. There's a petrified forest, and for many, many years people have gone there to hunt for fossils and indeed dinosaurs. I think the first plesiosaur was found there. Anyway, Mary Anning, so this is based on a true story. Mary Anning really existed. And she is now credited with finding the first plesiosaur in Britain. and she grew up, she was struck by lightning as a child, so there's this kind of slight sort of aura of weirdness about her in her community. And she grows up in really difficult circumstances with her mother. Her father tragically dies, so they're very poor. Her brother doesn't really like being out of doors, but Mary Anning has this lust for fossil hunting and this gift for finding them, and she collects them, starts to sell them, and gradually builds a reputation. Once you know, the Darwinism and the questioning of our origins obviously fascinated Victorian males, so they get drawn to Lyme Regis, and she assists them in finding fossils but gets no credit for it. And also in this story, there's a woman called Elizabeth who is middle-aged. She's a spinster, and she's come to live in Lyme Regis. Again, very straitened circumstances, but she's a very different social class from Mary. She's, you know, to Mary, she is really, Elizabeth appears really wealthy, and they strike up this very sort of unlikely friendship. And so in many, many ways, this is also a novel about friendship and what that means and where your loyalty begins and ends. But as ever with Tracy Chevalier, she looks so carefully, so thoughtfully, so realistically at the struggles of being female in an age where, you know, men dominate. There are some splendid scenes in this book where you really want to cheer the women on, and yeah, I just thoroughly enjoyed it. Now I thought I would mention, in the interests of balance, I tried to read this, Tangerine by Christine Mangan, and I did give it a good sort of 50-60 pages, but I really like the way it opens. So it's set in Tangier, which, you know, I was really up for that. I was up for some warmth. Very sort of what's the word, claustrophobic atmosphere, and there's obviously some awful thing that's happened in the past, the past of the female protagonist. She's in an unhappy marriage, she's living confined to this flat in very humid temperature, and a friend arrives. Now once the friend arrived, it kind of spoilt it for me. I felt, I don't know, the dialogue became a bit pedestrian. I didn't particularly care about either of them. I don't know, it seemed a little bit cliched, I thought, and so I'm afraid I DNF'd it, and I don't honestly think I'd go back to it. It's one of those books that maybe if I'd been on a beach somewhere, and you know, I probably would have, I suspect it's quite suspenseful, so I might have, you know, stuck with it, but I didn't. Anyway, there you go. That's my lovely reading for the month of January, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. I'm hoping February is going to be equally good. Certainly looking that way. I'm thoroughly enjoying the book that I've just started. I've also got my reading prompt book to find, which is going to be a book that has been on the Stella Prize list, which is the Australian version of the Women's Prize. So I'm really looking forward to choosing what I'm going to read for that, and hopefully carry on with my A to Z of my, oh, I can't do the backwards forwards thing, bookshelves behind me. Anyway, my arms are going. So yeah, lovely to talk to you all. Hope you're all well and hearty out there, and you know, seeing some positivity in the new year. And I'll stop talking now because I'm starting to talk more nonsense. Bye.